Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. How's everyone doing? Doing good? Thumbs up, middle down? Yeah? Okay, awesome. So in case it wasn't clear, I am not Disa. So my name is Zach. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Amsterdam. I spend most of my time researching facial expressions, bodily expressions, a lot on emotion, a little bit on social status and social influence. So I'm going to go ahead and give this lecture today. And we're going to talk about a few different things. So we're going to start off by talking about functions of emotions. We're going to talk about it at three levels: the individual, the dyadic, and then the group level. Then we're going to transition over to facial expressions. Research on emotion loves to study facial expressions. It's for sure one of the most hotly debated and also widely studied topics. So we're going to cover a good bit about it today. And then we will transition over to other types of expressions. So things like bodily expressions, vocal expressions, and we'll talk more about it when we get there. Okay, so after today's lecture, you guys are all going to be able to outline functions of emotions at three different levels of analysis, evaluate whether facial expressions are basic, describe and explain the in-group advantage, and give examples of different kinds of nonverbal expressions of emotion. Okay, and to get things kicked off, I wanted to ask you guys, tell me about a time that an emotion experience helped you in some way. This could be anything. This could be you saw a snake, you got frightened, and you successfully avoided the snake. It could be anything. Yeah?
I think stress, or stress about a deadline making you work faster.
Stress making you work faster. Yeah, I think that's a great one. Anything else? No one else has emotions? Yeah?
Seeing disgust on someone's face and then avoiding certain foods.
Interesting. So seeing disgust on someone else's face and then avoiding food. So in this case, it had some sort of like communicative function. I like that. Anything else? Yeah?
Or maybe just being sad and starting to cry in front of a friend, and then you can talk about it. I guess sometimes it helps me.
Okay, so like being sad, it kind of signals the other person that you could use some support, right?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah, I think these are all great examples. As we kind of talk about these examples, they fit into these three different categories. So on the one hand, right, they can serve a basic biological function. So I led off by saying fear. We move away from some sort of fear-eliciting stimulus. They can also have a communicative function, right? They can communicate a message, whether it's seeing disgust on someone else and knowing to avoid it, and also a more group-level social coordination effect. And we'll talk more about that later. But I want to start off by talking about this individual level, this effect of emotions on what we'll call basic survival here. And when we're talking about basic survival from emotion, we're often talking about emotion expressions. Now, it's not just expressions, but it's often expressions. So to dive in, I want to actually show you guys what emotion expressions might look like. So it's a great paper by Leora Abramson, and she photographed people the moment they were startled in a haunted house. Right, so these are real, genuine expressions of emotion. This is what people actually do when they're frightened. So I'm just going to show you through some of these stimuli. We'll go through these a few times so you guys become experts in them. Okay, we're going to go through this two more times. If you're on this side of the room, this time I want you guys to focus on the faces. And if you're on this side, you guys focus on the bodies, okay? We'll go through this one more time. Okay, and last time we're going to switch. So if you're on this side, now you focus on the bodies. If you're on this side, now you focus on the face. Okay, what did you guys see? Yeah,
For what? Body or face?
either.
Body-wise, I think being
Give me one thing.
okay, turned away from the what's fighting you. So they all seem like they're turning away, trying to like outgo, or turning their body away to like protect themselves.
Okay, so turning away from the fear-eliciting stimulus. Yeah?
They move their hand between the fearful stimulus and themselves.
Okay, so they put their hands up, right? Yep.
Everyone's shoulders go way up.
Shoulders up. Interesting. We'll talk more about that later. Yeah?
Wide eyes when they like trying to looking at the thing.
Okay. Wide eyes. Yeah?
The mouths were open, assuming they were screaming or something like that.
Okay, so mouth open. Anything else? Yeah?
The eyebrows are raised.
Eyebrows
Or
raised.
sometimes like this.
Great. Yeah, so we're hitting on all the key ones. But the thing that, well, yeah, and we'll talk more about this. So we named a bunch of behaviors, and the question on the back of my mind whenever I see something like this is, why? What is the purpose that they're doing this? And some of you started to talk about it, but I want to hear more. So why do people engage in this very specific set of coordinated behaviors when they're frightened? Yeah,
Protect themselves.
to protect themselves. Right? It has this functional element to it. Yeah.
Like maybe having really wide eyes means that you can, you're more aware of your surroundings, you can see more and take more in, so therefore you can respond to danger better.
That's unusually on the nose for my next slide. But yeah, it all feeds into this idea that we're trying to protect ourselves, right? Whether we're trying to respond effectively to some sort of stimulus or just physically create a barrier to something that might be a threat to us, right? We engage in these coordinated behaviors when we're threatened that function to promote safety in some way. And there was a great paper by Josh Susskind where he actually looked at the function of these emotion expressions. And what he did is he had people come into the lab and they posed these facial expressions of fear. So they had to do their eyes open wide, raise their eyebrows. There's a few more things that he also had them do. And he found a few interesting things. He found, first and foremost, that people had a larger visual field. So they could literally see a larger angle. In addition to that, they were also able to actually move their eyes faster. So this is consistent with this idea that facial expressions of fear enhance sensory acquisition. Right? The idea that we need to quickly decipher what's happening in the environment and respond to it effectively. So this expression that we engage in actually has adaptive benefits or adaptive affordances, such as being able to detect things in your environment faster. But of course, it's not just fear. Right? We see this for all different kinds of emotions. So in this same paper, he also looked at expressions of disgust. And he found that when he had people take on this expression of disgust, it actually decreased the nasal volume intake and velocity. So people weren't able to breathe as fast when they did this kind of face-scrunched disgust expression. Okay. So what might this be consistent with? Why might people do this? Yeah?
I mean, it protects the eyes from anything that could go inside. That's harmful because it's disgusting.
Yeah. It protects the eyes. It also protects us from intaking any pathogens or whatever might be in our environment that we're disgusted by. Right? We're closing ourselves off to it physiologically. So in addition to these kind of biological functions that basic universal expressions have, they also have a really important communicative function. So this is at the dyadic level. So when I say dyadic level, I mean two people interacting, having a conversation, or not, but interacting in some way. And of course, our emotion expressions also have implications for the way we communicate with others. So, paper by Lee, which also included Josh Susskind, who is the same guy I talked about before, he showed that when he showed facial expressions of fear to other people, it had a few interesting effects. So here you see these kinds of fear eyes. Eyes are open wide. And then another condition where the eyes are closed more narrow. This is disgust or neutral. And although the eyes are looking at us here, he had the eyes kind of bouncing around to different parts of the screen. And when he did this, he found, perhaps unsurprisingly, fear expressions actually made people more accurate at discriminating where the eyes were looking, right? So if our eyes are wider, we're more accurate at figuring out where they're looking. It also had faster gaze discrimination. So people not only did it faster, but they were more accurate. Well, sorry, they were more accurate, they were also faster. And faster target detection. So he would put a visual stimulus on the screen in some direction and would have the eyes look at those stimulus. And he found that when the eyes are looking at the stimulus, the rate at which they were able to detect this item on the screen was much faster in this condition where the eyes are open wide. Right? Perhaps unsurprising, it pushes our vision in a direction, which also enables us to respond adaptively. Right? So these fear expressions not only help us navigate the environment, but also from an interpersonal communicative level, it enables us to communicate better. Yeah?
In this setup, were the people like shown like the dilated or less dilated pupils before they had technology? Or were you talking about their own eyes?
So in this study, right, they saw literally eyes that looked like this, right? So, and just so we're clear, we're not talking about the pupils themselves. We're talking about the sclera in particular, which is this white part around their eye. And when they viewed these computer-derived images that were looking down and away, they would more quickly look down and away, and they would be able to more accurately decipher where the eyes were actually looking, and it would also help them identify a target on the screen. So they're looking at these fear eyes, essentially, compared to these neutrally expressive eyes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And if we get away from computers for a second and actually look at kind of real-world interactions, who's familiar with the visual cliff? Anybody? Okay, good. So I don't have to give a lesson on the visual cliff, which is good. But yeah, it's often done with infants, children, especially 12 to 18 months. You see a lot of this work. And if you guys are not familiar with it, it's essentially this elevated platform. And something like 80% of the platform is covered. You can't see through it. It has like a checkerboard kind of vibe to it. And then the remaining portion of it is plexiglass, and you see right through. Right? And this is something that is a little frightening for a child, I would say. Right? It doesn't look like there's a ground there. Maybe it's even frightening as an adult, who's to say? I don't know if you guys have seen those buildings with the plexiglass floors, but I don't like them. And what they would do is they would have a parent do these fear expressions as this baby would crawl towards them. And these would be facial expressions, they would be vocal expressions, and they want to see whether or not this child investigates this see-through floor. And what they find very often is, perhaps unsurprisingly, when doing fear expressions compared to neutral expressions or even some other emotion expressions like happiness expressions, the baby's a lot more timid and a lot less likely to explore this visual cliff. Right? And this is consistent with the idea that facial vocal expressions of fear can function as behavioral regulators, especially in these ambiguous situations. Right? If we're in an environment that we're not totally familiar with, we seek more information, and one of the things we rely on are the expressions of others. So in these dyadic situations, our emotions can actually shift people's behavior in really important and meaningful ways. Okay. The last level that I'm going to talk about is this group level. And this is more social coordination. And yeah, if you guys just think about some of the groups that you're in, whether it's your friend group, whether it's sports teams, whatever it might be, you know, perhaps shared emotional experiences foster group cohesion, right? It gives you camaraderie, it gives you shared experiences. Whereas it can also, emotions can create a barrier and kind of solidify out-group boundaries, figure out who, in some case, the enemy might be, whether it's a sports team or what. So these things also have impacts at the intergroup level. So not just for me navigating my context, not just for me interacting with one person, but actually me and my in-group, whatever that in-group might be. So Colin Leach put together a study where he had non-Aboriginal Australians talking about whether or not they believed other non-Aboriginal Australians had privilege over Aboriginals. And he found that when he had people engage in this task where they thought about this and they ruminated this, they felt things like anger and guilt. And these emotion experiences made them more likely to actually go out and take political action. They not only said that they would go do things, but they actually followed through and engaged in political actions that were designed to reduce inequality, specifically between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians. Right? So now we're not talking about emotion expressions here, but we're just talking about emotion experiences. Right? So not only do our expressions have impacts on helping us navigate the environment, whether it's with people or the world, but also the groups, and they can create, facilitate group behavior. Okay, does that make sense before I kind of push on to the next thing? Any questions about that? Yeah.
So the people who were more privileged, privileged group, they felt the guilt. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, so when people were tasked to think about whether or not their group was more privileged, at that point they felt more guilt. And those feelings of guilt explained why they went out and took political action. Yeah?
I can understand where the facial expressions come into play in all of this, or expression of emotion.
In the group level?
Yeah, like in this example.
So they don't. This is not related to facial expressions at all, right? And I think that's a good point. So like, let's be explicitly clear here. Facial expressions are one way that emotions are functional because they help you communicate with others and they help you navigate your environment. But devoid of the actual face that you're making, the actual experience of emotion itself can also be incredibly functional and foster a lot of things, right? So for example, if you're stressed about a test, right, it's going to make you study more, right? This is one example of a functional account of emotion, right? So this has nothing to do with the face. So from a functional perspective, emotions can be about facial expressions having some sort of function, but it's also the subjective experience that can guide behavior in addition to that. When you're at the intergroup level, most times it's the emotions themselves. That's just logistical because it's hard to communicate a facial expression to an entire group, unless you're on Twitter. Any other questions? Cool. Okay, so that's functions. Now we're going to move on to facial expressions. So I'm going to put the question back on you guys. How would you guys describe what this person is doing with their face? Someone try to give me a description. Yep.
Do you mean like what emotions expressing?
No, give me a physical description.
His eyebrows are up a little bit.
Okay.
His eyes are open. His nostrils are a little bit open. Mouth a little bit open.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's pretty good. Eyes are wide, eyebrows are raised, mouth is open, exposing teeth. So, yeah, we said something like this, right? Now, tell me about this face. Yeah.
I think you could describe it the same way. The only difference from the other one I would say is like kind of lean back. This one is just straight forward.
Yeah. I think more or less you could, so there might be a little bit of difference in the head movement, for sure. But more or less you could describe these the same way. And as face researchers, this produces a significant challenge, right? Because very subtle differences between faces can actually produce enormous differences between facial appearance, right? So, quick spoiler, on the left is a prototypical, well, any ideas? What's on the left? Name an emotion, just call it out. Fear? Perfect. What about on the right? Perfect. So, we describe these two faces using the same objective terms, but they're communicating completely different emotions, right? And what this means is that as researchers, we need to really take an in-depth approach to understanding faces. We can't talk about faces in these broad terms. Instead, we have to talk about them very specifically and comprehensively. So what we do is we break them down by individual facial muscles. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about facial muscles for the next little bit. I want to just say at the offset, you guys don't have to memorize any facial muscles. But I do want you to grasp the broader topics that I'm talking about here. But yeah, so when we think about muscle activations, we often think about bending at joints. But in fact, the face has about 40 muscles, a little more, and activation of any one muscle causes the skin on the face to move in certain ways, whether it's bulging, whether it's wrinkling, it could be a few different things. So what we do as researchers is we break all of these individual facial muscles down into something called facial action units. And we do this using a system called the facial action coding system. So this is a comprehensive, anatomically based system for characterizing facial appearance. Now there are over 40 muscles, so we have over 40 action units. Different action units correspond to different muscles on the face. So for example, like AUs 1 and 2, those are related to frontalis, whether it's lateral or medial. Brow lower is corrugator. So each one of these different action units correspond to a specific muscle. And the way that we identify faces is by looking at these individual facial muscles. Now I'll quickly say that getting certified to do FACS takes a very, very long time. It's about maybe 100 hours, I would say, and actually FACS coding images also takes a pretty long time. So it's a pretty labor-intensive thing, and this is one of the things that I think often throttles research in this area, is just the fact that it's a little bit hard to do, it's challenging, and it takes time. But if we go back to our fear expression, right, instead of saying the eyebrows are raised, the eyes are wide, maybe the mouth is open, what we can do is we can identify individual facial muscle action units which correspond to muscles. And we do this to articulate exactly what faces look like. This is a comprehensive system, so if we have just these numbers, we can reproduce this face almost exactly. And this also allows us to disentangle different expressions. Right? So if we talk about this in more specific ways, you'll see that the wrinkling here is only at the center portion of the forehead. It doesn't extend out to the lateral portion of the forehead. So there's a second part of this frontalis muscle being activated. You see a bulge down here. This is triangularis, which causes the lips to lower in this oblique way. So by starting to look at facial muscles, instead of just talking about faces in these broad terms, we're able to really break down exactly what faces look like and distinguish otherwise similar looking faces. So the point that I want to really hammer home is that to adequately capture the appearance of faces, it's necessary to examine faces comprehensively and granularly. And what I mean by granularly is at a muscle by muscle level. Any questions about that before I move on? Okay, so this is Paul Ekman. Does anyone know who Paul Ekman is? You guys heard of him? Okay, a little bit. So facial expressions can be thought of in a few different ways. On the one hand, when we see facial expressions, they're often these very elaborate, maybe even exaggerated expressions that people are doing, but they can also be really short and fast. And we call these micro expressions. And hopefully my sound works.
This is, you're going to see Cato Kalin, this house guest of O.J. Simpson's, who's being questioned by Margaret Clark, the district attorney, in an unfriendly fashion.
At the end of the year of 1993, he was dating Paula Barbieri, wasn't he?
And he's trying very hard to conceal how he's really feeling, which is he's very angry. And what he shows is a very fast micro-expression of disgust, anger, scorn. And he does something like that, but he does it much more quickly than I'm doing it, because it's a micro-expression.
Mr. Kalin, you got a lot of money for your appearance on Current Affair, didn't you?
Yes.
What you're seeing is scorn, a combination of anger and disgust, wrinkling of the nose, raising and tightening of the upper lip.
To investigate when the concealed emotion revealed by a micro-expression does expose a lie, Ekman set up an experiment. Volunteers could choose whether to remove a $50 note from an envelope in an empty room. He then interrogated them to see if he could spot the liars. This man had taken the money.
Did you take that money from me? Are you lying to me now? I did a really lovely micro-expression in the lips. It's an expression of disbelief that totally contradicts what he said. I'll show it to you again. Watch this area right here. Did you take that money from me? Yeah, it was just my money with you into this room. Did you take that money for an envelope? No. And then he shows us a disbelief micro-expression in his lips. So it really doesn't fit at all with what he's saying. This is, you're going to see Cato Kalin. This.
So who's heard of micro-expressions before? Has anyone seen Lie to Me? A few people. Yeah. So what do we think about micro-expressions? Yeah?
I was told it was a pseudoscience.
Told it was pseudoscience? Yeah. Okay. We're told from who?
My psychology teacher back in high school.
Okay. Yeah. So I wouldn't go so far as to call them a pseudoscience, but I will say that they get a lot of hype, especially on television shows, and what they're certainly not is a perfect science. So what I don't want you guys to do is go home and ask your friends or partners something meaningful, look at their micro expressions, and then use that to decide what you're going to do. Please don't do that. But I should also say that there is some evidence that these kind of quick, spontaneous expressions do leak some information, especially in high-stakes situations, and especially if they kind of co-occur with other signals of deception. But it's really not the case that small, subtle facial expressions reveal underlying information in a perfect way. So what you've heard about microexpressions, it's important to know that they do sometimes reveal information. They're hard to restrain yourself from doing because they're so fast. They're often reflexive, but they're not infallible signals. Yeah?
The information that microexpressions can give is strictly an emotional information, or because I think the biggest misinterpretation I would say that it seems that the emotion that is given through the microexpression is then interpreted as a lie or not a lie. That's like what like me did a lie. It's like, oh, this emotion means it's lie.
Yeah.
Is it not far-fetched to think that this emotion means that the person is lying necessarily?
So, I mean, when people are analyzing microexpressions, they're typically trying to pick up on underlying emotion signals, and they're using that to then make an inference about whether or not someone's lying. Whether or not there's some sort of automatic cue associated with lying independent of emotion, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, if like, oh, this microexpression says disgust, so they must be lying. You know?
It's an inference, right?
It's an inference that is it accurate necessarily?
Well,
Because
sometimes.
a person can be disgusted without being necessarily lying.
For sure, yeah. But of course we have to take emotions in context, right?
Yeah.
So if someone's asking you a pretty direct question and then you quickly show disgust or you quickly show fear, in the context, why might they be experiencing disgust or fear? Well, it could be because they're lying. But of course, right, this inference between emotion and behavior is often an inference, right? So that's where we kind of fall into a lot of traps. Yeah?
Are these inferences reliable enough to be used practically?
Sometimes, yes. And it's to the point now that Paul Ekman's group is starting to even train police officers to try to detect them. It's really uncertain, I would say. So to me, there's no clear-cut evidence either way. But using just facial expressions alone is not practical. I will say that. So what they often teach is instead of just relying on one thing, it's important to kind of triangulate. So you want to use people's tone of voice, you want to use what they're saying, you want to use their posture, you want to use their facial expression. You need a kind of cluster of cues before you're really able to form any reliable judgment about if someone's lying or not. What I'll also say is, what do you guys think people do when they're lying? Yeah?
They would try and cover up any mannerisms that you would normally stereotypically.
I hate that you said that. So that's exactly right. So people have this tendency to believe that liars, they're going to be anxious, they're going to be fidgety, they're going to be nervous. But the thing is that liars also know this. So when people are lying in low-stakes situation, like, did you take this $5 bill out of this envelope? People are like, okay, they're checking if I'm lying, so I'm going to be perfectly still, I'm not going to move, and I'm going to make sure I don't fidget at all. And as a result, in these low-stakes situations, you see that people often fidget less because they're intentionally and deliberately correcting their behavior to make sure that they're not appearing like they're lying. High-stakes situation, it gets a little bit different. When you put the pressure on people, it sometimes becomes harder to regulate these things, but in low stakes, people definitely do overcorrect their behavior. Okay, so we're moving toward deception, but we're going to back it up because this is a course on emotion, and even though I could talk your ears off on deception, I am not supposed to do that today, so I don't want to. So we're going to get back to facial expressions for a second. And so yeah, I pointed out a bunch of muscles on the face that are important for emotion expression. I mentioned that there are more than 40, but the truth is that there are actually more than 40. I guess I said that already, but we don't always know exactly how many muscles are on the face. So people's faces do actually vary quite a bit. Not that much, but in some important and meaningful ways. And Bridget Waller did a study of 18 cadavers, so dead bodies, and actually analyzed the muscles on their face. And one of the things that she found was that people have a lot of variability in their facial muscles. So raise your hand if when you smile you have dimples on both sides. Okay? Raise your hand if when you smile you have dimples on neither side. Okay? And raise your hand if when you smile you have dimples on one side. Right? So we see variability in here. And what is this? Right? This variability means that the muscles on our faces are a little bit different. Right? So this is the dimples are a splitting of the zygomatic major, which is this muscle that people use to smile. But when you see people with dimples or not, this is variability across faces. And she found evidence of exactly this, right? People's faces aren't exactly the same as you look across different dead bodies. That's kind of gross. But what she did find is that the facial muscles that were important for emotion, so the muscles that are used to express basic emotions, occurred in all of the cadavers. So all these different dead people had them, and also had minimal asymmetry. So she found some instances of some muscles on one side and not the other, or bigger on one side and smaller on the other, but these muscles that are important for basic emotion expressions were found on everybody and the most symmetrical. So the ones in light gray are ones that we see for basic emotions, and the ones in dark gray are ones that we that vary a lot more. Okay. So this research on cadavers does point to this idea that maybe facial expressions are something biologically based. And it brings us back to this question of basic emotions. So are emotion expressions basic? Is it something that's shared by all humans, maybe even across species? Or is it something that's uniquely human and differs between cultural groups? Anybody have any thoughts? Raise your hand if you think they're shared. Raise your hand if you think it's different across cultures. Raise your hand if you think it's both. Interesting. Yeah, so this question about basic emotions, it brings us back to this topic of universality, and I know you guys have probably heard about this 200 to 500 times by now. But I'll be the 501st time to remind you guys. So, from this evolutionary perspective, emotions are thought to be biologically rooted. Right? They're thought to serve different biological functions, and they're largely universal. And what I mean by universal is they're found all over the world. But on the other hand, from a constructivist approach, right, emotions are thought to be constructed from culture. Biology plays no role or not really a significant role in emotions, and they can be constructed in different ways. So how can we test this? How can we test whether or not these emotion expressions are likely to be universal or likely to be culturally constructed? Yeah?
We would try to search for very isolated communities and see if it still applies.
Okay, isolated communities. Yeah?
Tested in babies?
Babies, I really like that, and that's correct. Well, it's tough with babies. The reason that it's tough with babies is because if you find it in really, really young babies, it's really unlikely to be socially learned or culturally constructed. But if you don't find it in babies, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is socially learned and culturally constructed, right? Like you don't find puberty in babies, but puberty is a biological thing that happens to almost everybody, right? So babies is kind of this gray area where it's not perfect evidence, but if you do see it in babies, it's pretty good evidence that it is probably biological. In fact, there was a really cool study that looked at fetuses, and I thought that was really compelling evidence too. Anyway, so how else can we test this?
That's with blind people.
Oh, gosh, you guys are really just stealing all the thunder here, huh? Yes, you can test it with blind people. Anything else? Yeah?
Looking at some animals.
Animals. Exactly. So those are the two ways, well, we named four and they're all correct. But we're going to talk about these two ways first. We'll talk about some of these other ways later. We're not going to talk about babies, sorry. So we can see whether or not emotion expressions generalize across species and also across cultures. Now, in terms of across species, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but I do need to at least note that there's been a long-standing idea since Charles Darwin himself that animals communicate emotion in a way at least somewhat similar to humans. So in his book, Emotion Expression in Man and Animal, I think was the title. He gave examples of humans expressing emotion, gave examples of animals expressing emotion, and you do see some overlap. So this is a dog expressing anger or threat, and you see similar things when humans express threat. This is a chimpanzee doing a sulking face or a pouting face. You see babies do something relatively similar. And someone raised that you raise your shoulders when you're afraid. I forgot who said that, but this is a cat who's startled, and we see something similar in humans. Now, it's worth noting that these expressions are not exactly the same, and that's because, for at least one reason, that humans and dogs don't have the same facial muscles, right? We physiologically cannot produce the same expression. But it's also not so important that they do the exact same expression, but more importantly that they engage in similar behaviors, right? So what I mean by this is that if, for example, fear expressions evolved so we can detect and respond to fear-eliciting stimulus in some effective way, it doesn't matter if cats raise their arms and move their body back. What's important is that they're engaging in a suite of behaviors that also positions them to effectively respond to a fear-eliciting stimulus in an adaptive way. Right? If these emotions evolved for specific functions, well, humans aren't the only ones who need to avoid snakes in the park, right? Cats, dogs also need to do this. So we see these similar behaviors. This isn't to say that we're not trying to identify facial muscles of other animals. So I talked a little bit about facts, and we see this not only for humans, but now researchers are starting to do chimp facts for chimpanzees, mac facts for rhesus macaques, gibbon facts, orang facts, dog facts, cat facts, equifacts, and camel facts. So we're starting to do this with all different kinds of animals. And the purpose of this is to see if the behaviors that other animals do are homologous, or if they have some sort of shared, similar, at least function or appearance to the expressions that we see humans do. Yeah?
Is this mainly just research on mammals, or are they also going to try it on other types?
Yeah. How would you study a fish? I don't know. That sounds like a weird question, but it's tough. So people focus on mammals. They also tend to focus on mammals that are more evolutionarily closely related to humans. The idea is that maybe we can even track when along the evolutionary chain we started to engage in some of these expressions. So, for example, like the human smile is thought to maybe evolve from this bare teeth display. We mostly study mammals, but I think I can imagine a world where we move past that. Yeah. So we do study animals to see if they engage in similar facial expressions to human, even if not the same. And now we're going to talk about research across cultures. So I want to start off by saying that when people study emotion expressions across cultures, whether it's the expressions people spontaneously do or the expressions that are recognizable, from a purely constructivist perspective, we would expect to see something like this, right? Two cultures that share no overlap in the facial expressions that they do to communicate or perceive emotion, right? So this would be a purely constructivist perspective. And then from a purely evolutionary perspective, we'd expect something more like this. So two cultures that almost completely and perfectly overlap in the expressions that they do to communicate emotion. So a lot of times we see people arguing for this versus this, but in practice, it's really one of these middle two. Most people agree that there's some overlap, there's some cultural variability, and what they're really arguing about is the extent to which they overlap versus not. And as we mentioned before, the way that people often will test if emotion expressions are universal is something called the maximally divergent population test of universality. So I'm about to put a lot of text on the screen. I apologize in advance, but it is an important definition. The idea underlying the maximally divergent population test of universality is that if a population has little to no exposure to the Western world, but still expresses emotion in the same way, right? It's most likely some sort of evolved and potentially universal feature of human behavior. If a country or a culture has no exposure to the West and they still do it the same way. It's really hard to reconcile why they could have somehow learned and, well, I guess culturally transmitted this information, but instead it points to this idea that it's much more likely to be some sort of evolved mechanism. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is there an example of an expression that is not like known in the Western world, but it is somewhere else? Is there some research that has shown something? Or?
Yeah.
And what is it?
So there's a fear gasping face that I don't have in these slides, but I'd be happy to show you later. So there are some examples of expressions that are culturally specific. And I think that's what you're kind of getting at when you ask me emotion expressions. But I should also say, like, giving someone the middle finger could be considered an expression of anger, and that's extremely culturally specific. Right? So there are these explicit expressions, but I think you're talking more about these like spontaneously displayed expressions. So some are culturally specific, yes. Yeah, did I see a hand? Yeah.
But isn't universality part of the definition of a basic emotion?
It is. It is. So there is a universal fear expression, but there are additional fear expressions in some cultures. And then there are people who would argue that emotions aren't basic. Yeah.
So the research was done by like giving people pictures of facial expressions of different emotions, and then they identified them, or how do you do this? I just don't get like the procedure behind it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's talk about one of these studies now. So Paul Ekman, I love that transition. That worked out really well. So he did the first study in 1969, but then he did a follow-up in 1971. And he worked with the Four, who were a remote population in Papua New Guinea. This is the 70s, so high-speed internet isn't a thing, right? Television, they had no access to television, there was no electricity, they had no formal education, small-scale, unindustrialized, traditional society. And what Paul did is he gave people emotion scenarios. So he would say, you're eating dinner with your family, and a wild pig storms into your home and starts knocking everything over. And then he would show people 3 expressions side by side. And he would say, which of these 3 faces correspond to the story that you just read? So this was a 3-way forced choice. And he wouldn't just do this with a fear situation. He would do this with an anger situation. He would do this with a sadness situation. He would do it with a happiness situation, right? So he's testing many different emotions. And what he finds is that for these 6 emotions, happiness, anger, surprise, fear, disgust, sadness, they were recognized, even among members of this small-scale traditional society. And this was some of the first research to ever test this. And this is now what we talk about as the basic emotions. This is one of the most important studies in the field of facial expressions. Yeah?
And the people spoke English?
No.
So they had like someone who translated stuff?
Yeah, so the way that this happens a lot, so I've also done some research in a small-scale traditional society in Nicaragua with the Mayanga. And the way that it works is often you have to translate materials from, for example, English to Spanish, and then get them back translated to make sure your Spanish translations are good. And then often you're working with Spanish and a translator who speaks in the local language, and they'll translate on-site from Spanish to the local dialect. And then you have to go through the process of going from the local dialect back to Spanish, and then Spanish to English to publish. So there's a lot of translation that has to happen, because when we're dealing with small-scale traditional societies, English is often not spoken. So there are actually 2 different languages spoken by the Four, and in the paper, if you guys are curious, he also breaks it up by the 2 different languages, because different words can have different meanings in different languages in some situations. But he does find across both languages, these are the emotions that were recognized at levels significantly greater than chance. Yeah?
Do you know if in this study they found if the cultures also had their own words for the emotions?
Yeah, so it wasn't something that he tested. Yeah. But people are still following up and looking at culturally specific language. Thanks. Cool? Yeah?
And the criticism they mentioned in the textbook was that like the people basically just excluded the stuff that didn't really match the scenario and then landed on the correct option, but maybe it wasn't because like they would recognize the emotion, but they sort of like just excluded ones that didn't fit this.
Yeah, and for my next transition, I'll talk about some of the limitations. And one, the one you point out is definitely one of them. So, right, if people have to select between 3 forced choice options, what if they think it's none of these? Well, they still have to guess. I don't. Yeah, so that's definitely one limitation. It was within subject, so multiple people did this multiple times. It's possible that they could have gotten there through process of elimination. In my own experience, I find the process of elimination argument to be a little bit weak because it kind of builds on this idea that we're Western test takers, so we're used to one answer corresponding to one question, and therefore, if I put it with this, it wouldn't be anything else. That's a very Western way of thinking things that happens from repeated test taking from our experiences, so I don't think that's necessarily a non-Western thought process in the same way. But nonetheless, could be a limitation here, and of course, these are posed facial expressions. Right, so these are not people who were frightened in a haunted house and were going to show their face. These are expressions where we said, I want you to do this, 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 and this, and then I'm going to take a photo of you. So it's not a perfect study. There are definitely limitations, and there are limitations that have been tackled over and over since the 70s. Did you have a question?
Yeah, it was more about testing not necessarily expressions, but the universality of it. Anyone look at like languages? Because if there are 6 basic emotions, shouldn't every language have words for it?
Yeah. Yeah, and there are definitely a lot of people that are analyzing like lexically words that correspond to emotions. Like one example is neutral. There's not always a word for neutral. Even in Spanish, I think it directly translates to neither happy nor sad. So, but you could be fearful. Anyway, so yeah, people are looking at emotions, but I can't say for certain whether or not there's fear, anger, sadness, happiness discussed in every language, but it would be questionable if there wasn't any translation of the word. Yeah. That was a very long-winded answer, sorry about that. Yeah?
Do you know what was the accuracy?
Accuracy. So he finds accuracy to be between 65 and about 85%. It's a pretty big range. It does also vary by the emotion. One thing that I thought was interesting is that where you look at confusion, so if you're inaccurate, what do you inaccurately select? They often find fear and surprise is highly confused, which I think is interesting because if you guys remember from the beginning of the talk, I put fear and surprise next to each other, and they were generally similar facial expressions. And then happiness. And happiness is kind of different from everything here because anger is a negative emotion, surprise is middle of the road, fear is negative, disgust is negative, sadness is negative, and then you have happiness. So it's not always clear when you see recognition in this study for happiness if people are recognizing happiness or just recognizing not negative. So happiness is way up. Happiness is at like 95%, but everything else is between like 65 and 85%. Yeah?
If it's a maximally divergent test of universality, why is it a limitation that they have white happiness?
It's a great limitation. And when I say it's a great limitation, it's a great thing to notice that it's a significant limitation. Because it's hard to, if you're going there for the first time, the process of, in 1971, of photographing someone, printing their photo, laminating the photo for reuse, and then using it for stimuli, introduces logistical challenges. So it was the first study that had to be done. He also did some research on how the 4 expressed emotion, and then eventually would use those stimuli. But for the first study, he had to bring something as stimuli, and that's what he defaulted to.
But then why is it open that they would wait if you're trying to look at like 2 populations that are totally different from one another, whether they recognize the same emotions, then why is it a problem that they would have to?
Why is it a problem that they wear white turns?
Yeah.
I think that's a great question. We'll talk more about that later. Anything else? Okay. So yeah, some of the limitations that we talked about. Forced choice questions was a big one. Also, people couldn't really freely say if they thought it was none of them. So then there was a paper by John Haidt and Dr. Kellner in 1999. And this looked at people from India and people from the US. So I'll quickly say these are not maximally divergent populations. These are cultures that do have exposure to each other. And instead of giving them a story and asking them to select a face, he would just show them a face and then say, what has happened to make people feel this way? He does find similar results. So basically, if you ask people to give a scenario that would cause a facial expression, they would give a scenario that was theoretically consistent with the emotion expression being displayed. So it's probably not purely due to the forced choice nature, or purely due to the selecting between three, but there is still evidence, even across cultures, that people do recognize emotions, or can attribute emotionally laden stories to facial expressions in theoretically consistent ways. And now we're going to talk about, so even though that these expressions are very generalizable across cultures, it doesn't mean that culture doesn't play a role. I want to be crystal clear about that. So we often find evidence of an in-group advantage. And what you're going to see here is that if a person is from culture A, they are recognized better than a person, so let me phrase this better. If I'm from culture A, and I'm perceiving someone from culture A, I'm going to recognize them better than someone from culture B. Right? So I'm better at recognizing emotion expressions of people from my in-group. And this goes both ways. So if I'm from culture B, I'm going to be better at recognizing expressions of someone from culture B than culture A. Right? So we have this in-group recognition ability. So if we go back to the 4 with Paul Ekman, why is it a problem that he used white targets? Well, it's not a problem insofar as these expressions are meaningless, but if he used culturally specific expressions from the 4 themselves, what do we think would have happened? Yeah?
Faster and more accurate recognition of the faces.
Yeah, higher levels, higher accuracy level. Right? So people are better at recognizing those from their in-group. So even though we do see, or Ekman finds, that people do recognize these expressions across cultures, in fact, we might be underestimating the true accuracy in some of these studies by using people from different cultures. Why do you guys think this might be? Yeah?
Because people within the same culture are more likely to have a similar facial muscle structure.
Hmm.
So I assume we're quicker to recognize the coping or those specific emotions within our culture compared to the other whose muscles can deviate a little bit.
Okay, so it's not so much about the muscles of our neutral faces, because remember I did say that even across these 18 cadavers, but you also see across cultures that the muscles that people have on their face for the basic emotion expressions do tend to be pretty symmetrical and consistent across people. So everyone does have these muscles. It's possible it could be something related to neutral faces. But one of the real strong drivers of this is something called dialect theory. So this dialect theory is kind of the theoretical foundation explaining this in-group advantage. And they talk about emotion expressions kind of varying much in the way that accents vary or dialects vary, right? So two cultures might have the same language, but they might use slightly different dialects. In the same way, two cultures might have the same facial expressions, but they have slightly different variations. Right? So maybe one culture raises their eyebrows more, maybe they raise their eyebrows less, maybe they activate one muscle more, maybe they activate one muscle less. But there are subtle nuances that enable culturally specific expressions. Now, to be clear, they're still recognized across cultures, but much in the way that a Canadian might understand a Canadian accent better than a Canadian would understand a British accent, right? A Canadian seeing a Canadian expression might better understand what the emotional signal is from that message than a Canadian listening to or viewing a British person's face. Yeah?
But with the study, like before, admit them maybe into a strong suit if they, despite them like different cultures, that they still have high accuracy scores.
Yes. So accuracy is still there, right? And what this suggests is that, in fact, some of these recognition rates that I was talking about might underestimate what they could truly accomplish from an in-group member doing the exact same facial expression. Well, not the exact same, but their culture-specific variant of that facial expression.
So that's why it's a limitation, or like pointed as a possible limitation.
I wouldn't call it a limitation as much as a point for future research, right? It's not like, it doesn't mean that that study's bad, but it does mean that, in fact, recognition could be a little higher. I guess you can call that a limitation, yeah. Okay. So we've talked about functions of emotions. We've talked about facial expressions. And we're going to go on to other nonverbal expressions of emotion. But first, we're going to take a little break. So we're going to take 10 minutes. We're excited for this break. We're going to take 10 minutes, and then we'll convene back here. 12:06. Oh, no. Hey.
First of all, I really like the lecture. It's very interesting stuff.
Great, thanks.
I was wondering, I once read in a book, it's called like I think Body Language for Dummies or something.
Okay.
And they explained something that there should be something like above your eye, which you can only control while you laugh like automatically.
Duchenne smiles. Yeah.
Is that really a thing? Like, are you able to like to see when somebody's really smiling or somebody's pretending to smile? Or are there any other like facial muscles that you can only go on automatically?
So, is my mic on? No. So for the last like 50 years, the Duchenne smile was this uncontrollable, this
yeah.
Orbicularis or oculi. It's a circular muscle around your eye. When you activate it, it causes these like crow's feet wrinkles.
Where is it?
It's over here.
Okay.
If you see these like crow's feet wrinkles, that's orbicularis oculi. And the idea has always been that smiles that contain this additional muscle, they're unfakeable, they're genuine signals of enjoyment. People are really having a good time. I personally disagree with that because people do it all the time. Like if you look in a yearbook, you'll see about 50% of people can spontaneously do it when they want. And if you look at posed stimuli, happiness up here, it's really subtle, but you can see slight evidence of these crow's feet wrinkles. So what this means is that like
there are
people
people
can do it.
But there are people who can, right? I don't know if it's true. I just read it and I thought it was interesting.
The narrative that people like to talk about is that these Duchenne smiles are these genuine signals of enjoyment. They're uncontrollable. You can't think them. I think recently that started to shift. Like within the last like 2 to 3 years, people are starting to push back.
It's the same with like the micro expressions, right?
Yeah. It's really cool in theory, and it's also tough because like what's also incredibly clear is that people who are genuinely enjoying themselves are more likely to show this Duchenne marker. So it does signal genuine emotion, but it's not unfakeable. That's not true. So anyway, that's one of the things that I'm looking at now. Actually, is if when people pose their smile, if they do Duchenne smiles, if it reflects things like well-being, personality, because I think it's a type of self-expression. When people want to come across as warm, friendly, happy, they're more likely to do the smiles.
I find it super interesting. If you ever need like any help with some research,
send me an email.
I would love to help.
Yeah, send me an email. We're always conducting studies.
I find this stuff so interesting. This is like almost the reason I studied psychology, because I was like, why do we behave the way we do? Why do we have emotions? What's the function of emotions?
Yeah, that's
what
I do every day. So yeah, no, I'm glad to hear it. And yeah, send me an email and we'll find something to do. Perfect. Awesome.
Maybe an emotion trigger like the other one? Like if you down, I don't know, with your eyebrows, it should be more like alternate.
I don't know, but I think it's a really interesting question, especially because almost from like a tradition perspective, you'd expect like if these things all co-occur, I can imagine a world where like if you do one half of facial expression, you automatically react differently. So I don't know. I've never seen any research on it, but like I think I share your intuition that partial expression might actually foster the rest of the expression.
I was thinking like, it's a little bit too, but when I do my mascara, basically I notice I always like open my mouth.
Yeah.
Sort of like when you're surprised, and that's always something like, why do you do this? It makes no sense, but then I was thinking maybe it's like if you're in surprise, you also like, you open your mouth and then you widen your eyes, but it's just like
I love that idea. No, it makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah, no, I'd be surprised if anyone's done stuff on it. But I'm sure people have speculated why people open their mouth and put mascara on. I'm curious to see
but
what they talk about.
maybe there's no reason
Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think about how you would test that. And I'm wondering, like, if people, I don't know, maybe you could, like, try to surprise a bunch of people, and people who do more prototypical facial expressions of surprise would be more likely to open their mouth when they put mascara on. Maybe these things are first things are done. I don't know. But yeah, no, it's an interesting question. Sorry, I don't have an answer for it. Hey, that's how science is.
The animal comparison thing got me thinking about like that sheep don't really have a lot of facial expressions. Okay. And then I thought that animals have like expressive eyes, but sheep not so much. So I was wondering like the
You know a lot about
eyes.
sheep.
No, from a farm. So
Are you?
Yeah. But we don't like not a sheep farm, but we kind of
Sure.
it's like. Is there like also like a function of eyes in like because like and not only like whether they're open or not, but the eye itself.
Yeah.
Is it like how what's the word? Like dogs and cats can make it different, or like dogs especially eyes or something.
Yeah, so I think a lot of what we're seeing with eyes is actually eyebrows, rather than the eyes themselves. So the eyebrows are like hands down the most expressive part of the face. Without question, you can communicate every emotion from just the eyebrows alone. So the eyebrows are really important. So I think a lot of what we're seeing is actually eyebrows, not eyes. But what I will say is that the eyes themselves are often important for gaze cueing. So like if I look down and away, you're going to be more likely to also look down and away. But the ability to like distinguish pupils from sclera to identify when someone's looking is a lot stronger in humans than other animals. So like chimpanzees don't gaze cue the same way. They move their entire head if they're trying to like direct gaze. So that's what I would say about eyes across species. I think a lot of times you're going to be dealing more with facial expressions, or especially bodily expressions, more than faces. Like if I think about when my dog is like frightened, it's like freeze kind of thing, or like ears up, and yeah. So I think the eyes themselves Maybe not as much across species, just because animals vary in the extent to which they place importance on the eyes. But like with humans, we always look at the eyes first. If we're walking down the hallway, it's the first thing we look. So we really, really matter. So I don't think the eyes is where the magic is for cross-species communication. But
And is it also the eyebrows more than what you think?
the eyebrows. I mean, no one teaches you, right? No one says that when your eyebrows are like this, they're sad, and they're like this, they're angry, and they're like this, they're fearful. Or if they're like this, they're surprised. Like, no one goes through that lesson, we just kind of know. But the eyebrows are super important, for sure. Yeah. Okay, so I didn't have my mic on for the first half of the lecture. If that happens again, just like raise your hand and let me know, okay? That's, hopefully you guys were all able to hear me in the back. But we're going to go ahead and dive into part 2. But before we dive into part 2, I have to dive into part 1B because I forgot to tell you guys about something. And I actually want to just raise an interesting thought and then quickly transition to the rest of the lecture. And I'll apologize for that in advance. But if we're talking about emotions as these biological responses, it would follow logically that we would do them all the time in all situations no matter what, right? So if I do this fear expression because I'm frightened and it functions to help me better detect things in my environment, it shouldn't matter if anyone's around or not. When I'm afraid, I'll do this expression. And of course we see that in certain situations we might want to downregulate an expression or try to hide it to some extent for communicative purposes. But I also want to point out that some researchers have argued that emotion episodes can have these social motivations. So there was a study on bowlers, of all people. Raise your hand if you like bowling. Nice. I really like bowling. I'm very bad at it, though. And what they did is they looked at how people did after they bowled, and they measured their smiling expressions. Perhaps unsurprisingly, if people did better, they smiled. But what was interesting about this study is that people didn't really smile if they were facing the pins. They didn't really smile until they turned around and looked at their friends. Right? So if these are innate biological responses, it's curious that they would happen specifically when we're looking at other people. They should happen all the time. So this is to say that in addition to these biological motivations, they also can be socially motivated. So we might be more likely to show certain expressions in certain contexts. Right, so they're not only context specific, but they're also can be socially motivated. Okay, I left that out of part 1A. So now you guys are all experts in the social motivation of emotion expressions, but we are going to transition over to bodily expressions. So in addition to the face, we can also research bodily expressions of emotion. We don't study these as granularly because it's hard to correspond muscle activations to specific movements, right? So if I activate my corrugator muscle, it's going to cause the same thing for my face every time I do it. But I can activate my bicep like this, I can do it like this, I can do it in many different ways. So a muscle activation doesn't correspond to a visible change the same way. So with bodily expressions, we do end up talking in more kind of holistic ways, which, as I pointed out, for the fear and surprise expression of the face, it can be problematic, but right now this is kind of where we're at. And nonetheless, we can still communicate emotion with the body, including many different expressions. Anyone want to take a shot at what expressions are being shown here? What's on the left? Sorry, I heard someone yell it. What was that? Perfect. What about left middle? If you guys aren't experts in this by now, I'm so worried. There we go. Fear. What about here? What's that?
Happiness, joy.
Yeah. Happiness. And what about here? Sadness. Yeah. So I think these happiness expressions in particular are a little bit interesting. And using these stimuli, right, all of these expressions are recognized at levels greater than chance, some as high as 95%. This is often recognized as happiness. I think this is the weakest test because here you're pitting happiness against sadness, fear, and anger. So 3 negative emotions versus a positive emotion. So it's unclear, as I mentioned before, if people recognize happiness from the body or if they just recognize positive emotion. So for example, I could imagine a world where something like pride might look similar to this. But nonetheless, there are a few limitations with this. Just like the Paul Ekman photos that we talked about before, these are posed expressions. So these are not what people spontaneously do when they're angry with someone, or sorry, these photos aren't taken when someone is angry with someone. They're not taken when someone is frightened by a stimulus, but instead these people are instructed how to position their body. Now, it's worth noting that these instructions aren't coming out of nowhere. So the way that we instruct people to move their body is often consistent with what people actually do with their body in the context of these emotions. But nonetheless, recognition of these kinds of expressions is recognition of posed expressions, but spontaneous expressions from the body are also recognized pretty well. So in addition to being recognized pretty well, they're also recognized across cultures. So there's been evidence of recognition of bodily expressions of emotion in the Netherlands, United States, United Kingdom, Israel, China, Japan, and all of these are cultures that are more industrialized. But there's also been evidence from less industrialized, small-scale traditional societies, including places in Cambodia and Nicaragua. I've underlined that because that's me. So yeah, and someone mentioned this before, and in addition to recognition of bodily expressions of emotion across cultures, you guys, I forgot who said it, but someone mentioned we can analyze people who are blind. And I want to tell you about this study very quickly, but this is one of my favorite studies of all time. This was actually the study that made me decide that I wanted to go work with Jess in Vancouver for my PhD. And what she did is she studied congenitally blind people. So people who have never seen in their entire life. And she studied them at the Paralympics and also had a control sample from the Olympics. And she found that sighted, blind, and congenitally blind individuals from more than 30 nations displayed pride using the same sets of behaviors as sighted people. Now, what does this mean? For me personally, it's really hard to reconcile how someone who has never seen in their entire life could have somehow socially learned the sets of behaviors that people do in response to pride experiences. Right, so this is much more likely that it's some sort of evolved and potentially universal feature of human behavior. Does that make sense? Okay, so we've talked about bodily expressions, and when we're talking about bodily expression, oh, yes?
I remember I often taught how people behave. So, for example, in audiovisual movies, they say the character is raising their hands, so maybe they pick it up and try to.
Yeah, it can't be ruled out. Absolutely, it's certainly possible that there's some sort of explicit learning that happens, right? Maybe they're told that when people are proud, they raise their hand above their heads, they smile, they tilt their head up, they'll expand their chest. I don't think, personally, that this is something that people are very often explicitly taught, but it can't be ruled out. There's also other explanations here. So one of the biggest critics of this paper suggests that over time, people just engaged in random behaviors, but when they did pride expression consistent behaviors, maybe the crowd got louder and reinforced their likelihood of engaging in these behaviors. I really don't like that explanation because it requires them to figure out how many people are out in the crowd, so they can't just use the loudness of the crowd. They have to do like loudness per person, and it also assumes they can optimize their behaviors to the loudness of the crowd, and if they're trying to, I don't know, I don't agree with it. But yeah, it's not a, there's never going to be one study that's going to be the perfect explanation, and you're absolutely right. Something like explicit learning, it's possible that these people from around the world who are congenitally blind were taught to do this when they're proud for some reason or another. My personal perspective is that it's much more likely that this points to it being an evolved thing. Yeah?
But for the last explanation, has it not been a study where they replicated this type of study, this congenital blind people with, in a more controlled environment? So, surprises, emotion expressions of surprise or pride in the lab without any other people. Would it not also act in that way?
Yeah, so this is the only study to date looking at congenitally blind people expressing emotion with their body. People have done it with the face, especially David Matsumoto's done a lot of work in this area. But this research is from a good bit of time ago. And like small sample sizes, it's really hard to interpret, but they do find that congenitally blind people express other expressions similarly. But it still has the same limitation. It's possible they're told, when you're happy, you should smile. It's also possible if you're talking to someone on the phone and they're smiling, you could probably pick up if they're smiling. It'll change the inflection of their voice, right? So we can, and maybe over time they're like, okay, so how do I make my voice sound that way? I would have to do these behaviors. So there are other ways besides visual modeling that learning can happen. I just think the most likely explanation is that it's probably evolved, especially when you take it with evidence of cross-cultural generalizability, and that's why we're talking about all these things today, right? Because it's not any one study that's going to be like, yep, that's it. It's just not going to happen. We have to really triangulate with all different methods and materials and samples and populations. Yeah?
This might be a bit off topic, but is there a difference in how quickly congenitally blind babies start making facial expressions? Like smiling, that's kind of a big developmental stage usually.
Yeah, I don't know about a difference, but I will say that there was a study that came out that did ultrasounds of fetuses, so before they were born, and when mothers had carrots, which are sweeter vegetables than kale, they were more likely to do these facial expressions of happiness. I think that, I think it's also pointing to the idea that it's innate, but also when babies don't always smile immediately, right? So why they would smile in the womb and then not out of the womb immediately and then might do it more later, I don't know exactly, but there's also definitely research looking at the early development of these expressions. Okay, we're gonna hurry along here. So we've talked about bodily expressions. We're often talking about what postures people put their bodies into, but in addition to the specific configurations that people do, movement also matters. So I'm gonna show you a couple of point light displays. We'll start off by telling me what is the emotion in this one. I'm going to show it one more time, since I think it takes a second to orient to what I'm showing you. So now we'll take a look. What emotion do you guys think? Anger. And here's another one. Happiness. No, just kidding. Of course it's sadness. So yeah, like here we're losing visual information, but we're still able to pick up on the emotional message, right? So the idea here is that the dynamics of a behavior, in addition to the actual visible behaviors, communicate emotion. These are called point light displays. They're also accurately recognized. Recognition tends to be a little bit lower than full light displays because we are losing some information, especially anything relating to the face. But nonetheless, they're still recognizable. So these movements can communicate emotion. There's also been research showing that if you ask people to knock on a door and do it happy versus sad versus angry versus neutral versus surprised, people can knock on the door in different ways, right? So there's emotion being communicated in all these different ways, movement being one of them. And finally, speech, right? So you can definitely say the same thing in two different ways, and it could mean two very, very different things. Now, when I'm talking about speech here, of course, hi, I'm Zach, I'm sad. This is one way to communicate emotion. But also, hi, I'm Zach, sad, right? So we're talking not only about language, but also speech prosody, right? So the intonation, the speed, the tone, and the features of what I'm saying can also have emotionally laden messages. And I want to quickly show you guys this really cool tool by Alan. So yeah, we can communicate all different kinds of emotion with our voice, and these emotion vocalizations are also recognizable at quite high rates, including across cultures. We'll talk about some of that later. But you can communicate things like amusement. Disgust. Pain. Relief. Fear. Oh man. And things like sadness. Confusion. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are all different ways we can communicate emotion. And what I'll point out here is we're not using language, right? We're using other features of vocal communication to communicate emotion. So yeah, I'll also include these in the slides. I haven't posted the slides, so I'll do that after this. But the link is up here, so if you want to check it out yourself, feel free. Always a good laugh. So yeah, there are all these different ways that we can communicate emotion with our voice. Let's talk about across species. So I'm going to play you a video of a primate being tickled. Because what else would I be playing you right now? So perhaps it's worth noting that this is not exactly how humans laugh, but it did have some similarities, right? So you hear this like rapid, fast rate of breathing. The big difference is chimpanzees tend to vocalize on the inhale, whereas humans tend to vocalize on the exhale. So that's what's accounting for a lot of these differences, but this chimpanzee's having fun. He's even like keeping his foot there. So the guy continues to tickle him. So we do, especially laughing, which would be part of the emotion of amusement, is something we do see evidence for vocally across species. And it's not just chimpanzees. So humans and lots of other primates will laugh when tickled. One interesting finding is that animals that are more genetically closely related tend to laugh more similarly to each other. So a human and a chimpanzee will be a lot more similar than a human and a fish, for example. And this points to this idea that laughter is homologous across primate species. Right? It's not exactly the same, but it has shared features and similarities. Yes?
What about vocal expressions in deaf people?
Vocal? Oh, man. You should ask Disa about that. Yeah. Disa has the only paper, to my knowledge, testing this, and I will save that answer for her. Yeah. What about rats? Mice? Do we think we can see vocal expressions in animals very distant from humans? Yeah? The answer is yes. Congratulations. So one study wanted to see if they do this sigh of relief. So what they did is they would show animals show these mice a light, and then it would immediately after be accompanied by a shock. That was one condition. In the other condition, they would show this light, and it would be accompanied by a tone. And this tone would indicate to the animal, congratulations, there's not going to be a shock. So if this happened to me, I'd be like, oh, good, right? We would do this sigh of relief. And this is not something specific to humans. So if we look at the rate of sighs per hour, we do see that these mice were more likely, engaged in more sighs of relief in the tone condition when compared to the no tone condition. So obviously, we all have different kinds of voices. If we look across species, our ability to make sounds varies. So we can't always look at the same exact things, but we do look at what we can. So if we're looking at very distant animals, often we'll revert to things like sighs of relief and features like that. Okay. So I was asked about deaf people communicating vocal expressions, and I'm not going to talk about that, but I will talk about something different that was conducted by Disa herself. You guys are, she's really, she's quite the leader in the field. You guys are really lucky to have the opportunity to take her class. I wanted to highlight that. And I also wanted to highlight that because this is Disa's study, perhaps if you have many questions about it, you should just go ask her instead of me. But anything else, I'm happy to answer. But I'm excited to present this work, and some of it will be on your test, so I wanted to make sure I included it all. But she studied the Himba of Namibia. Now, the Himba are cattle herders, which also makes them semi-nomadic. So they had to kind of go from place to place, in part to find water and food for the cattle. There was no electricity or schools. They had little to no exposure to the Western world. So this is an example of a maximally divergent population test of universality. And what Disa wanted to do is she wanted to see if vocal expressions of emotion are generalizable across cultures. So much like Paul Ekman's initial work on this research, Disa would give them a story, and well, one thing she did is she asked them to actually make vocal expressions so she can collect them and then show them to participants. And I want to just give you one example of what one of these vocal expressions might have sounded like. So I'm going to play you a vocal expression. I want you to think about what emotion this person might be communicating. I'll do it one more time because I know it's short. Any thoughts? Yeah. Excitement. Interesting. Okay. Yeah?
So if I understood it correctly, they were asked to play it, right? So like to act it out?
They were given a story and asked to act out the emotion.
Okay, so then I would say more something like is not scared or fearful, like a situation where they're uncomfortable, and then afterwards he breaks out into laughter about playing this emotion.
Yeah, so I definitely share your sentiment that it starts with one thing and then it ends in amusement, because I think maybe this person thought the task was silly. I don't want to assume what they're thinking, but I share that intuition. So we're focusing more on this first part. So you said fearish, something like that? Cool. But it was tough, right? It was a little bit complicated. Raise your hand if you think it was a positive emotion. Okay, and raise your hand if you think it was a negative emotion. See, this is really interesting, right? We're disagreeing on one of the most fundamental features of an emotion, whether it's positive or negative. So I will say that this person is acting out the expression they would do if they had just killed a mountain lion on his own, right? So this is something consistent with pride, right? Achievement, maybe even excitement, but this is the emotional story for achievement, right? This person achieved something. So what Disa did is she recruited these participants. They were given a scenario. So for example, this person just killed a mountain lion on their own, and then they were played two different emotion vocalizations on two different, mice, essentially. So she would click one, it would play it, click the other, and then it would play it. And then the participant was tasked to select the emotion that corresponded to the story that they had just heard. Of course, she didn't just do this for amusement. She did this for all kinds of different emotions, specifically 9 emotions, 4 trials each, so it was 36 trials total. And this was what we call a fully crossed 2x2 design. So what this means is that Himba listeners and English listeners who were from the UK, in a separate sample of participants, would listen to vocalizations produced by English speakers or vocalizations produced by Himba speakers. Right? So I'm not going to go through all of this data because we don't have all day, but I do want to at least talk about one of these groups. And it's the reason I'm talking about it is because it's one of the most important groups. And it's going to be the Himba listeners listening to sounds produced by English speakers. Right? So this is cross-cultural recognition. So this is really one of the first tests of whether or not individuals from a small-scale society with little to no exposure to the West still recognize vocal expressions produced by Westerners. Yeah?
So what were the numbers then?
Say that again?
What's the 29, 25?
That's a good question. Those are the sample sizes. Sorry, that's incredibly unclear. And here's what you found. So the first thing you'll note is this horizontal line across the center of the screen. I just want to point out that this means chance responding. So if they did 4 trials for every emotion, including anger, disgust, fear, sadness, surprise, and so on, right? If they had no idea, if they were randomly guessing, they would have still gotten 2 trials right based on chance, right? If you're flipping a coin and you don't know what the outcome is going to be, you're still probably going to be right about 50% of the time. So if they were randomly guessing, we would expect to see responses basically at this line across the board. Instead, what we see is that for anger, disgust, fear, sadness, surprise, and amusement, the average number of trials that they got right was significantly greater than chance. Right? Pointing to this idea that they do accurately recognize these vocal bursts of emotion. What you'll also potentially recognize is that achievement and pleasure are not greater than chance. So if we go back to the vocalization by the himba, and this is a little bit different than what this is showing, but there was a split about what emotion achievement was communicating. In fact, I would say there wasn't even a split. We couldn't even agree if there was positive or negative emotion, right? And this is consistent with vocal utterances of achievement not being recognized across chance. Now, of course, this is himba listeners listening to English speakers, and what we were talking about before was English listeners listening to himba speakers, so it's not the same thing, but it nonetheless still points to this idea that achievement isn't as recognized across cultures. However, most importantly, we do see evidence that the basic emotions are recognized across cultures. At least in one small-scale society. And I want to leave you with one more thought. Now, we talked about chance, right? So here we're averaging across all the emotions. So we're not looking at each individual emotion. We're just looking overall, do people recognize vocal bursts of emotion across all these different types of emotions? And here's what Disa found. She found that for Western listeners, they were more accurate when listening to Western sounds than when listening to himba sounds, right? This is a significant difference. So Westerners were better with Western sounds than himba sounds. But himba listeners, on the other hand, were more accurate when listening to himba sounds than Western sounds. Right? So what is this consistent with? What would we call this? Yes? Perfect. This is evidence of cultural dialect theory, right? This is the in-group recognition that we were talking about before. And we talked about it in the context of facial expressions, but it's not just faces. It's faces, it's vocal bursts, it's also bodily expressions. This isn't something specific to faces, this is more broadly characterizing emotion recognition. Right? So there are also cultural dialects in the vocal expressions that we make. And the other point that I want to make is that it doesn't matter if you're a Western listener, a himba listener, listening to Western sounds or himba sounds. All of these are above chance. Right? So what this is consistent with is that across these at least two different cultures, people are able to recognize emotions from vocal bursts. However, there's nonetheless cultural variability. Right, so this is evidence of both generalizability, because everything is greater than chance, but also cultural variability, because there's an in-group advantage. Right? So we often talk about these evolutionary constructivist theories, or more specifically, generalizability and cross-cultural variability being at odds with each other, but that's not the case. This is a prime example of how these things can both happen at the same time. Generalizability and cultural variability do not necessarily have to be at odds. Does that make sense? Yes?
The Western listeners seem to score better even in himba sound. Is there something there?
What do you think?
It's more important maybe in Western culture. If we're more exposed, would it maybe to see more people in general?
Okay. Yeah, it could be. It could be a true difference in skill, which might be emphasized by, just a reliance on vocal tone. I don't think that's what's going on here. What I think is going on here is it just has to do with test taking. I think Westerners are test-taking experts, and this isn't something that the himba are particularly familiar with, right? So in many cases, this might be the first time that they're ever, I don't even want to call it a test, but like being examined in this context. So I think just by virtue of that alone, we wouldn't expect recognition rates to necessarily be as high. So I think it just has to do with cross-cultural differences and like test-taking experiences and maybe being frazzled by the situation too, right? This is a weird situation that you're putting people in. It could be a reliance, but I don't necessarily think it means that. Cool. Anything else? Awesome. Well, on that note, after today's lecture, you guys should all be experts at outlining functions of emotion at 3 levels of analysis, right? Individual, dyad, and group. evaluating whether emotion expressions are basic, describing and explaining the in-group advantage, and giving examples of different kinds of nonverbal expressions of emotion. Well, that's all I got. Thank you guys for being here. I'll hang out up here if you guys have any questions. And, I'll see you soon.
I was wondering, has there been like much done on, well, this sort of thing and autism?
Oh, yeah.
And what's like what can we, I guess we can learn certain things from looking at autistic people, right? I work with them, so I'm interested.
Yeah, really?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of research on, so of course, like one of the main deficits of like autism is just like emotion interaction. So there's definitely decreases in facial recognition of emotion. Some evidence of decreases in in recognition of bodily expressions of emotion. Some people also argue that they're better at recognizing emotion from the body than typically developing people. I think it might be because people without autism tend to make eye contact a lot more, so they're probably learned a lot more about the face.
Yeah, it's also almost like, because they are, it's almost like they're more cognitively aware of it rather than like it being a second nature, an innate thing. It's like they're more hyper aware.
Yeah, it's possible. Like when you're trying to like study it for your own purposes, like in a very explicit way, if you really deliberately attend to it, you might lose it. I've recently started doing some autism research, but I'm pretty far off. But if it's something you're interested in studying, like I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, because like I guess how they also, do they show it differently from like when they're really young? Like do they, like for example, I don't know whether I would intuitively say that they would or not, because I kind of say no, they don't think they would smile any less as a baby.
People don't really know, and the reason that they don't know is because it's really hard to characterize facial expressions, and it requires a lot of training, and people who do that work tend to not be dealing with people with autism.
Yeah.
So especially like developmental trajectory of like smiling in people with autism versus not, there's really not much. Most of the research on autism looks at their ability to recognize expressions.
Yeah.
Far less looks at the way they produce them.
Interesting.
And there's also like this topic of masking that you see that autistic people do.
Yeah.
They just like deliberately will position themselves in ways. So there's this nonlinear effect. So if you're really low on the autism spectrum, you might not have the emotional intelligence to engage in these kind of masking behaviors, but if you're really high, so there's also this question of like, are these differentially impactful at different points along the autism spectrum?
Yeah, it's true, because it's so diverse and it's cool. Yeah, I work with them doing helping them improv acting.
Oh wow.
Yeah, which is like it helps them where their deficit is, like getting out of ritualistic thinking, listening and responding.
Yeah. How many people?
I work with all different. It's kids from like 11 to 19.
Really?
Yeah, and it's like it depends on them in The Hague sometimes in Amsterdam.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Would you ever be interested in doing research?
Yeah.
Because if you are, like, I can think of no one who's better positioned than you to like really answer interesting questions like this.
Okay.
So if it's something you're interested in doing,
it is.
we should talk.
Yeah. Definitely.
Especially like if they're doing improv acting, right? The question of how people diagnosed with autism might communicate emotion is like so important, and it's not well understood.
Yeah.
So dealing with people who are asked to engage in acting is like exactly how you would do it.
Okay. Wow. Okay, that's good. Well, it fascinates me because just when I think like I have like a certain theory, it like I come across information like that they do that changes that.
Like what? Can I ask?
Yeah, like gosh, like sometimes they have like they can have a really high level of self-awareness, but that self-awareness they like when they're in the spotlight they can freeze up, but then afterwards they're like, oh yeah, well, I know that I freeze up. It's like kind of hard to explain when you think about that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Think
But
about it.
since I've been doing this course, which I love, like this specialization, it's completely convinced me to do research. So yeah.
That's where all the fun happens.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just a quick question about the Kimba site.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering, I'm guessing the original text was written in English or something like that, and had to be translated. So now I'm wondering if they did any checks to see the maybe emotional impact of that original text and then the translation was similar. So I can imagine something gets lost in translation.
For sure. To be honest, I don't know the translation process, but yeah, fortunately, like Disa, she's the one. So,
I'll ask, yeah.
Yeah, what were you thinking?
I mean, I don't know. I'm guessing they had somebody on the team that was also a language expert.
I'm sure they had someone that was like able to converse in those.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. She'll be able to tell you very first if like there were translation issues.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm just wrapping
No,
up.
I'm just setting it up for a guest lecture, so I don't actually have to prepare anything.
Easy.
It's always nice days. Yeah.
Have a good day.
You too. Sure.